We're at the American Atheist National Convention in Phoenix, Arizona, and once again I am interviewing Eddie Tabash. And how would you describe yourself to the general public? I mean, you're an attorney, but you're like a constitutional law. How would you say?
Well, I'm a constitutional lawyer and criminal defense lawyer. And even though I'm a lawyer and not a trained academic philosopher or scientist, I also do a lot of philosophical debates against religious apologists on the question of God's existence. Basically, I used to do more general practice law. Now I'm primarily a First Amendment lawyer with a side practice of criminal law defending what I call victimless crimes, primarily women arrested for prostitution. And so, politically, it's interesting. I'm one of the most fervent enemies, not even opponent, enemies of the religious right, but I'm otherwise pretty centrist. You could call me a liberal, but you couldn't call me a far left winger. And what's interesting is the interview we're doing right now is precisely 4 years after we did the same type of interview in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
And there, I said the Supreme Court was going to start issuing rulings to unravel the separation of church and state. 4 years later, I wish I didn't have this gift of prophecy.
Yeah. And having reviewed your presentation from this morning, I want this to have as much publicity as possible, because I am surprised at the number of people in the Republican Party who call themselves patriots and do not understand what they are doing to the country that they claim to be patriots of. And the number of people who identify in the Constitution Party who don't understand that the votes that they're casting are actually undermining the very thing that their very namesake. So these people do not understand how they're destroying their own interests.
They don't, and there's something else too. In 1981, after Reagan's election and bringing the religious right with him to Washington, I became active in efforts to fight the religious right. In fact, on January 20th of 81, right while Reagan was being inaugurated for his first term as president, I was defending abortion rights at a speech on a local college campus in the Los Angeles area. But what I said to people like Norman Lear, who began the first organizations to fight the religious right, is we're making a mistake if we think this is just a liberal to left cause. There are economic libertarians and conservatives who want limited government, and we need to involve them. That this transcends left-wing, right-wing. The religious right is an encroachment on personal freedom that no American would accept. And then I remember in 1989, Mario Cuomo, then governor of New York, came to Beverly Hills for a speech, and he said something that I'll never forget. And afterwards he told me that I have to promise that even after he's dead, which is now, that I would give him always credit when I use the quote, and I'm happy to. He said, it's rank hypocrisy of the religious right to preach to us about limited government and then to turn around and tell us, the American people, what God to believe in and how to apply the judgment of that God to our bodies and to our bedrooms. And I said, Governor, it's not bad for a Catholic guy. And so what we are facing with the religious right is the resurrection, if you'll pardon the pun, of medieval religious tyranny. This is the bumper sticker when religion ruled the world. It was called the Dark Ages. And what we have to do is we have to recognize how the court is doing it. There's a two-pronged approach. One is to say government can now favor religion generally. But the method they are using the most frequently is allowing only the religious to avoid complying with laws that are binding on the rest of us. And with this, I want to talk about the case that's going to be argued next week before the Supreme Court here in April of 23. This is a very bad sign. The lower courts ruled our way, and it's a bad sign the Supreme Court took this. If we lose, they're going to wipe out decades of precedent. A Christian postal worker claimed that his co-workers had to cover for him on Sundays because he had to take Sundays off for religious reasons. They tried to accommodate him, but non-religious co-workers or co-workers who didn't have a Sabbatarian religion kept saying that their rights to be with friends and family and recreational time is just as important as the religious person's religious concerns, and that weekend rest and recreation should not be diminished legally because they don't have a religious reason for wanting Sunday off. We won in the lower court, we won in the Court of Appeals. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court took the case. If we lose, we are going to have the religious totalitarian demand that secular or different religions, if you don't have a religious reason for wanting a weekend day off, you're going to have to work to cover for a coworker who has a religious reason for wanting that day off. So the religious reason trumps, if you'll pardon the pun, all other reasons for wanting a weekend day off.
Now, my perspective has always been that if religion is your sole justification for any action or policy, then you still have not given a reason.
Exactly. One of the things that happened when we lost the decision about the Washington State football coach, where he was actually holding prayer meetings on the football field involving both teams and large numbers of spectators, and the Supreme Court said no, the majority said he was off by himself in private prayer, where they totally distorted the facts. One of the things the court did was to overrule the Lemon versus Kurtzman test, where a government action had to have secular purpose. It couldn't either inhibit or advance religion, and it had to avoid government entanglement with religion. Now what the court is saying is, in interpreting the First Amendment, we're going to look to historical practices. Well, there are numerous historical practices which violate. For instance, as I point out now, the First Amendment coexisted for 10 years with the Sedition Act, which completely violated the free speech clause. So if you say we're going to go by historical practices, well, you can ban all of birth control, you can do anything. Now, yesterday, a religious right-wing judge in Texas,
Of course.
yes, a Trump appointee,
Of course.
who actually was lead counsel for many Christian right-wing groups before he was finally confirmed by the Senate, as a federal judge, issued a nationwide ban on the abortion pill, and this abortion pill has been used in 54% of all abortions in the United States in the first trimester, which is 54% of all abortions in the United States if you take the total number. And he banned it even though the FDA didn't want it banned and the manufacturer didn't want it banned. And then simultaneously, an Obama appointee judge in Washington State ruled that the FDA must continue to provide the abortion pill. What's going to happen is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals will uphold the requirement that the FDA provide the pill, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, governing Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, will rule that the pill cannot be used anywhere in the United States, and the Supreme Court will have to determine which set of rulings prevails. I'm frightened about what they're going to do.
As you predicted 4 years ago,
Yeah.
when you told me what the religious right was going to try to do to put religious activists on the Supreme Court,
Yeah.
to tip the scales, to literally undermine everything our country stands for.
Exactly.
It is alarming to me that all of the people who advocate, all of the people who are our enemy in effect of what they're voting for to empower these people to undermine the country, they think they're the good guys. They think they're morally righteous in what they're doing. They're the ones that are about personal liberty.
That's a contradiction. Yeah.
They don't realize it. I mean, I can't reach people in my own family to understand you don't know what you are doing to yourself, to your own family,
Yeah.
by voting these people into power, and I can't reach them.
Yeah, well, the thing is that one of the arguments that I want to make when the abortion pill gets to the Supreme Court is that even Kavanaugh, in voting to overturn Roe versus Wade, said this goes back to the states. So what I want to do is use the Dobbs ruling, which overturned Roe versus Wade, and say to the court, Your Honors, you can't uphold the nationwide ban on the abortion pill because you said abortion is up to each state. Now, they might say that doesn't apply here because the judge found this particular pill has been used since 2000. And the judge yesterday in Texas said that it never went through proper safety approval procedures. So he's protecting the women of America.
So hold on, I just want to be, after 20-some years.
23 years.
23 years of continuous use,
Yeah.
without significant incident.
Exactly.
Okay. I didn't realize we needed 50 years of trial.
I didn't either. I didn't either. And it's interesting because in the state where you live in Texas, if I could debate someone like Ted Cruz and I could have a large audience, I would say the religious right is an alien element to the Texas mentality because this is a state that's always valued rugged individual liberty, and nothing contradicts that more than religious intrusion by the police power of the state into the bedroom.
Yes.
I mean, if anything, I would expect Texans not to be religious right Republicans, but libertarians.
What I often see in my own state and in my own family is this divide of people who are, it basically comes down into two classes of people for many things. Those who look at the population mechanics and they see the broader picture and they're willing to make concessions for the greater good. And then you have the other side who basically say, if it doesn't directly affect me, then I'm not going to do a damn thing, and I don't care about other people who aren't me or who are different from me. And that's the distinction. If you want somebody to be considerate of somebody else's needs, fuck you, I got mine. That's the attitude.
But what has to happen is if you believe in individual liberty, you know, if you're, I'm afraid I'll be stereotyped, if you're somebody in Texas who's in some outpost somewhere with your guns by yourself and no trespass signs all over the place, you don't want to be consistent the police power of the state trespassing onto other people's properties. You don't want them breaking into the homes of the same-sex couples and arresting them. You don't want them arresting people for abortion. See, this is the, you don't want, the Texas Republican Party says Texas is, that we're meant to be a Christian nation. That's inconsistent with personal liberty. So, again, when I had a debate last year at the Federal Society in San Diego against a prominent religious right-wing lawyer, at the end of the debate, I said, think that I've not come to bring peace to the Federalist Society. I've come to set member against member. Half of you call yourselves libertarians. You need to start a civil war in this organization because as libertarians, you cannot accept the religious right. and a lot of the students were agreeing with me that that is an internal division that needs to be duked out. And so, but you see, this is in order. The separation of church and state movement has never properly sold to true conservatives the concept of limited government extending to things that they don't want the religious right to do. The only time that worked is when the most prominent conservative United States senator of the 20th century, from where we are now in Arizona, when Barry Goldwater turned against the religious right toward the end of his career because of that very same notion.
Yeah.
But others, don't tread on me means don't burst into my bedroom too.
Yeah. I've quoted Goldwater so many times on his prophecy about what's going to happen to the Republican Party when the religious right takes over.
Yeah, and it's...
But again, you can't reach modern Trumpist Republicans anymore. There's no communication with these people. They don't understand how they're voting against their own interests.
They don't.
And they don't understand the value of religious freedom because they see themselves in the majority. And whenever the Christian religious right sees themselves in the majority, then they think they're fully authorized to impose their edicts on everyone else. And when they want to do like faith-based initiatives where government funding for faith-based schools, it isn't until a Muslim school wants some of those funds that suddenly the Christians realize, oh, well, we're a secular country and we can't be funding Muslim schools, well, I guess we can't fund Christians. Well, why did you not realize that before?
It's like when I used to try to explain the environmental movement to Orthodox Jews, and I used to say, I don't care how religious you are, none of you want mercury in your gefilte fish, And so it's, and also the right-wing ultra-Orthodox Jew, what are they going to do about the January 6th protesters wearing T-shirts that said Camp Auschwitz? How do they handle that? And how do the right-wing Orthodox Jews handle Trump, who said there are good people on both sides, meaning Nazis? Yeah. After the Charlottesville explosion in the fall of 2017. It's exactly as you say. People don't realize that when you limit your neighbor's freedom, you limit your own.
Didn't you say in your speech that they're starting to say that only the traditional religions will get some kind of special privilege?
Yes.
So they can exclude Muslim from that because they say it's not traditionally American, they say?
The way it works is there's a law. It's a good question. We all have to comply with this law. But if you're religious, you don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, now, Thomas, when he's not taking luxury cruises and flights, Clarence Thomas had the view, and unfortunately he picked up another supporter of this in Justice Gorsuch, that the Establishment Clause doesn't protect individual liberty. He has this bootstrap, twisted approach where he and Gorsuch say the Establishment Clause just prevents the federal government from interfering in state establishments, which means each state can have an official church. So this is, really, it's, for instance, again, talking about religious fundamentalists, an Orthodox rabbi asked me what I thought was my psychological and emotional impetus. Where did it start to devote myself to fighting the religious right? And I said it probably started as a very little boy when I realized my mother was an Auschwitz survivor. That plays into not wanting government to impose horrendous restrictions and dictatorial policy on people. And so, see, this is, now your question, which is an excellent one, this is what happened in 19, and we killed it. Trump and Pence wanted to put forward through an executive order, but we got it stopped and it didn't go through, that you don't have to do anything to violate your religion. They wouldn't admit it, but what this would mean, let's say a building collapses and you're a Christian firefighter and you see a gay person trapped in the rubble. As long as other firefighters are there to immediately extricate him, you don't have to if helping gay people is against your religion. But we beat that back. And so the question is this. The question to those who think that the non-believer is not equally protected by the First Amendment as various religions. There's a restaurant open to the general public. The three of us go in wearing our atheist convention t-shirts. The proprietor says, "I'm sorry, I can't serve you because my religion says I can't do business with atheists." Now we know if that same proprietor said, "I can't serve you because you're black," that's completely illegal.
That's on the horizon, though.
Yeah. Would the Supreme Court allow a sincerely held religious belief to now permit a religious owner of a business that does business with the general public to not seat an atheist at a lunch counter? I don't know. I hope they would not go that far, but I don't know.
I've seen arguments put forward that it's their religious belief not to serve, not to support interracial marriage or things like that. So it's like a test case, and then what they can get away with, they get bolder and bolder.
Yeah, exactly. I've always predicted that there's going to be a point of second-class citizenship for atheists. And again, playing on a bit of the Nazi analogy, but I don't want to be, one of those hysterics that say they're the equivalent at this stage. No, they're not. But Nuremberg laws started with, okay, Jews can't do this, Jews can't do that. If only the religious can get away with not complying with otherwise universally applicable laws, it's going to be atheists can't do this, atheists can't do that unless they profess a religious belief.
Which is what you're saying is already effectively the case.
We will know more when the employment case comes down. But the thing is, the court has never upheld and has never dealt with a case of a religious person doing business with the general public who doesn't want to do business with atheists. That'll be the test. So let's say, for instance, that you're a privately owned bank, and they're all privately owned. If you're found to discriminate against minorities in loan practices, whether you did or not, as some banks have found out, very large banks, if the allegation looks like it's going to stick, you're going to pay billions of dollars to the ones discriminated against, and the courts won't let you discriminate. What if you are the owner of a regional bank and you are dyed-in-the-wool, born-again Christian, and you say, I don't want to harm anybody, but my religion says I can't do business with atheists. I will not make a home loan to an otherwise financially qualified atheist. What happens then? I would hope that the court would stop there. If they don't, that's the red line, because that means loss of civil rights.
This isn't far-fetched in our experience. When we went to Skepticon, just a gelato business owner heard us talking about our Skepticon Atheist Conference, and he shut the business down for the day and said that that was against his beliefs to serve us. So, like, if they are emboldened by the law, how much worse is it going to be?
Yeah, exactly. But what I would argue is that given, and I used to do this, I didn't have time at this convention to give the complete history of the First Amendment. It's clear that believers and non-believers are to be equal before the law. Therefore, you can't empower anyone to discriminate against non-believers. So my argument is that the Christian restaurant owner can no more legally refuse to seat and serve atheists than to seat and serve Buddhists.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not declaring atheism to be a religion.
Right. What it is a viewpoint on matters of religion. If, when you look at the history of the creation of the First Amendment, and you look at its principal architect, James Madison, and the influence Thomas Jefferson had on them, what they are most concerned with is protecting equal rights of conscience for all viewpoints. So, for instance, when Jefferson was in Paris, 1786, Madison pushed through their joint bill for religious liberty in Virginia, and this was 3 years before Madison drafted the First Amendment. And Jefferson, many years later in 1821, said he was delighted that the bill not only protected non-Christians, but the infidel of every religion. So it's clear. And also in September of 1789, when the Senate had what was going to be the First Amendment, it rejected two proposed wordings that would have just stopped government from favoring one religion over others. They were rejected, never brought back. And so the final wording, no law respecting an establishment, means no law showing respect to any establishment of religion. And throughout the debates, it was always protecting the rights of conscience. So that means any viewpoint on matters of religion deserves equal protection, and a view that the world is natural should be no less protected than a view that the world is supernatural.
There are some atheists of maybe libertarian bent that will maybe argue that it's trivial. They don't want a gelato anyways. It's not that big a deal. And they don't understand the impact of making something a national law that you can refuse service in a place of public accommodation, not a private club, a place that accommodates the public.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about, we're going back to the mid-60s in the case of Heart of Atlanta Motel versus Katzenbach, Attorney General, when the owner of a motel on a highway in Georgia said the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forcing him to rent hotel rooms to black people was unconstitutional because it encroached upon his private property rights.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first constitutional test to the Civil Rights Act of 64. Well, he lost. But our argument has to be that a religious viewpoint minority is just equal to anyone else. And Madison said so, so we know what was in his mind. He told Jefferson just a year or so before drafting the First Amendment, he was afraid that the general public would narrow the rights of conscience. And also it was Madison who fiercely supported in the initial Constitution, before even the Bill of Rights, the Article 6, Clause 3 prohibition of any religious test for public office.
Mm-hmm.
He said public office should be open to merit. And then also in his remonstrance against assessments of taxes to pay all clergy, 1785, Madison said that almost 15 centuries of Christian government have led to just pure oppression.
Mm-hmm.
So the principal architect of the First Amendment intended for us to be equal. And in fact, when he was president, he actually opposed chaplains before Congress and in the armed services. And after he left the presidency, he wrote about his concern that religious bodies shouldn't even be able to hold property. So he was, I mean, this was...
this isn't just deism.
Yeah, this isn't just deism. So what we need is we need Supreme Court justices like David Souter, John Paul Stevens, who would recognize, or even, see, back in the 50s, when the liberal-conservative divide didn't restrict intellectual independence like it apparently does now, where John Marshall Harlan II was a complete supporter of separation of church and state. And you couldn't say to him, well, how could you want non-believers to be equal before the law if you always side with the police in other cases? They got nothing to do with each other. In fact, they're lumped into one category of liberal versus conservative.
I don't...
In fact, in 1961, or thereabouts, or at some point before Roe versus Wade is decided, Harlan wanted the court to take up the abortion issue. So this is a completely... But the thing is, the Constitution is enforced as a minimum of 5 justices say it is. So our only hope right now is to treat every presidential election as a referendum on the Supreme Court and every election for the U.S. Senate. Because the Senate has the power to affirm or reject a presidential nominee.
So you just made reference to the Constitution, but what you haven't made reference to is the bigger news that was part of your presentation this morning, the clincher at the end.
Okay, the clincher is very dangerous. I myself only found out about this 6 months ago, and thanks for reminding me, because
this is a big deal.
yeah, this is the biggest deal. The religious right, flying under the radar, is promoting the first constitutional convention since 1787 in which the entire Constitution can be rewritten or thrown out. They need 34 states to ratify the convention call. They already have 19, and 6 additional states have had it pass at least one house of their legislature. It has to pass both houses of the legislature, or in Nebraska, which is unicameral, one house, but it already did. And if they get to 34, we have our first ever constitutional convention since the original one, and anything can be done.
And you pointed out that among the many things that could be done with an entirely new Constitution.
Yes, entirely new Constitution.
Means all of our Bill of Rights. You've already said that the Supreme Court has already abandoned Lemon versus Kurtzman.
Yeah.
They've already abandoned the Lemon test. They've abandoned precedent. They're going to whatever they erroneously consider to be an historical interpretation, which means that it's coming down to their own interpretation.
Yeah.
Fuck precedent. Yeah, and it doesn't matter what the Founding Fathers actually explicitly explained in their determination of why they wrote the Constitution this way. None of that matters, because we're going to write a new Constitution, and that new Constitution could very easily and almost certainly would say what the religious right has been trying to say for the longest time, that we are a Christian nation, in which every non-Christian, and non-Christians would include Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and Catholics, among others, as well as atheists, any other religious perspective or non-religious perspective, we would have no rights We would be second-class citizens in our own country.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
this, and I don't know what the current numbers are for non-believers, the bigger group. Are we not like 25% at least of the country now?
You see, that's the point. Is that doesn't matter if the Constitution is changed against us, because we're going to have to figure out how to get our delegates. If the same states that voted to call the convention are the ones to choose the delegates, we won't have any of our people at the convention.
How many congressmen admit to being
Yeah.
atheist
And
or
that-
secular?
So here's the thing: the ratification of the changes require only 4 more states, 38 states. So you need 34 states to call the convention and 38 states to ratify what the convention did. And the ratification process is in the state legislature. So if 34 states vote to hold the convention, knowing very well what's going to happen, it's going to be very difficult to stop 38 states from ratifying these things. We would have to, on the First Amendment, we'd have to hopefully hold it at 36 or 37, and it would be a nightmare.
And this is what I was talking about when I said that the Constitution Party doesn't know that they are actually empowering the very destruction of the Constitution that they're naming
No,
themselves.
they have no
The
idea.
issue I'm taking here is with I think, past Catholics as a larger segment of the we are tax-paying citizens of this country. They do not have the default right to dictate the laws
It comes
to the
down
rest
to
of
the
us.
vote.
Yeah, it
So,
comes down to.
If you don't mind my saying
yeah,
this, because this is something I hear from even the atheist community often. It's a broken system. Don't vote. You protest by abstinence. No, that's how you get bet over and let the bad guys win.
Yeah,
By not voting.
Exactly.
And that's how we got where we are.
exactly. So, you see, it doesn't matter how law-abiding we are.
Mm.
In fact, if the Constitution is changed to require belief in a supernatural being for full citizenship, it doesn't matter how upstanding non-believers are.
How tax-paying.
Yeah,
We're paying for their religious schools. We're if the private vouchers
But
go
even
through.
that doesn't matter because we're largely an oligarchy now.
Yeah, so
It does matter.
if the
No, it means that our efforts have to be more extreme. It means that the voting in the booth is literally the least we can do.
We don't have to justify our reason to have rights equal to everybody else. We're
That's
tax-paying.
not what I'm
We're
saying.
just as no, but I'm saying that people should not look at the Christian majority, the eroding majority, as they have the right to dictate to the rest of us, and we have to fight back. Is what
right,
I'm
but the
saying.
way to fight back right now is to stop this convention. Because if it's called, I don't think any of us will be able to become delegates.
Yeah.
That's
and,
so.
And
Not even Bernie Sanders would admit to being atheist
Yeah,
in the
no.
entirety of Congress.
right. No, he said what he said.
Of course I believe in God. The God I believe in is we're all in this together.
No, yeah, exactly. He said, to me, God means we're all tied together. Yes, that's his God.
Yeah.
But he said, I'm no atheist. Well, he is. If
Yeah.
you believe that there is just a cosmic rope that ties all of us to each other, then he's a pantheist.
At best.
At best. Yeah, he's-
On the issue you're talking about if they call a constitutional convention and the delegates, how they would select the delegates. Keith Lowell Jensen, I don't know if you saw his comedy routine last night. He was saying, I hate to call the South, because if you really look at the United States, any place 15 miles out of a metropolitan city is effectively red. I'm paraphrasing him. So like land gets a greater representation in who picks these delegates than how many people live in that state. Like in a state like Nebraska, where it's unicameral, and people in Omaha and Lincoln perhaps outnumber the rural parts of Alaska. It's not the South, but these rural voters will likely pick the delegates over for a constitutional convention over most of the people in Nebraska.
Yeah, and
The
so,
way districts are drawn,
well,
gerrymandering.
I'm not sure how it's going to work, but it seems the legislatures of all the states will pick the delegates, which means that 2/3 of them will come from states that made up the 34 states to vote for the convention.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
And
I don't know how.
State legislature districts are often gerrymandered to favor rural districts. We live in Texas,
Yeah, but
so
see-
we've got huge populations that get their voice quieted because they've got a district that runs all the way from Dallas to Austin, that's cut in with a rural vote. So their state legislature is overbalanced by rural versus the most of the people that live in Texas.
Yeah.
And that's why the Texas delegation won't reflect any of us.
Yeah.
If the Constitutional
Exactly.
Convention is called. So this is, the stopping this convention from being called is right now the top priority. Because I myself, who's an observer, I didn't see this underwater torpedo. So this is extremely important because our freedoms only depend on what the Constitution says. If the Constitution says we're no longer free, then we're no longer free.
And then again, it has to be interpreted by the court, which,
Right.
as we've seen in Australia, they took the same language from our Constitution, and their conservative, then religious panel interpreted it entirely differently than the United States did, which I don't understand. It's the same words. How do you
Right.
read it so very differently?
Exactly. But I think we won't even have to do that because the delegates will be clear. This time, it won't be vague, broad language with certain contours and outlines. This time, it's going to say that this is a Christian nation, or full citizenship depends on affirming a belief in a supreme being, and it's going to say that publicly denying the supreme being is not protected by this Constitution. I mean, we're going to have specifics in there.
Yeah.
And some people maybe think you're doomsaying, but we're already starting to see this play out in states where after the Roe versus Wade, where it was struck down, people are trying to make laws to force 10-year-olds to give birth to children.
It's amazing to me how unaware the religious right is. Are they unaware, or are they just non-caring?
Both.
About the needs of like all of the other people, their constituents, the other people in this country who have and deserve rights.
They're thinking there's a miracle that this 10-year-old give birth and it'll be just fine, and that's not overwhelmingly medically accurate. That 10-year-olds can give birth and it'll be fine, and they'll do the same thing with it.
In many cases?
In some cases, not prepared, and like ectopic pregnancies. Those are overwhelmingly not a good idea to force anybody to give to go to term with that.
But there's no consideration.
They think there's going to be a miracle, though.
A blastocyst has more value than someone who can read.
Yeah, and exactly. And this is, so for practical purposes, everybody has to contact their state representatives in both houses, or in Nebraska's case one. If the state hasn't fully ratified it, you have to try to get everybody you know to contact their representatives to try to persuade the state legislators from ratifying it. If it's passed in one house, you have to try to stop it in the other house. Now, this is unclear, but we have to attempt it. If you're in a state that has already ratified it, you have to try to get the legislature to reverse itself. Now, I don't know if that'll be upheld. There's no real law on that, but we have to try.
How do people look up whether they're, do you know how people can look up whether their state has already ratified this and what stage they're
Okay,
at?
I actually have the list.
Thank you.
Okay. The 19 states that have fully ratified the convention call: Alaska, Utah, Arizona, North Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas,
Of course.
Missouri, here's a shocker, Wisconsin.
That was, compared to everything else you just read, yeah, that was a surprise.
Yeah, Indiana, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, West Virginia.
All the most backward states apart from Wisconsin.
Now, the 6 states additionally where it's passed one house of the legislature is New Mexico, South Dakota, Iowa, New Hampshire, Virginia, and North Carolina. So in those 6 states, people need to try to stop it in the other house, and in the 19 states to try to see if there can be a reversal.
Okay.
And my argument is there may not be able to be a reversal when a state is voting on a proposed constitutional amendment, but there may be able to be a reversal when for the first time it votes on the Constitutional Convention. I don't know if that'll fly, but we need to try that, because I think that we need to hold this in any event at the 19.
Yeah.
So if we take...
Now that we know that these dominoes are falling.
Right, exactly. So let's take both sets, the 19 that have done the convention call and the 6 where it's passed at least one house. That means that in 25 states, half the states, at least one house has passed the convention call.
Yeah.
So, and then of course, what needs to be pointed out is one of the prime movers of this is the true Prince of Darkness of the religious right, Steve Bannon.
Yeah.
So, but again, the greatest fear is that, and when I say our people, in this sense, I don't mean other atheists, I mean liberal religionists who oppose the religious right, that church-state separationists won't wake up in time to stop this.
It's not simply a matter of cakes or gelato. If you live in a rural area and the only hospital in town is a Catholic hospital, and you need an abortion to save your life, what are you gonna do? Die? Or if you have enough time, try to move to another state. They're trying to already criminalize what they call abortion trafficking if somebody helps you go to another state to get an abortion.
And if you need an abortion for medical reasons, under the current, what they're trying to impose, it would mean that you would have to alert a magistrate to get a ruling on whether you can live. Which is why, one of the many reasons why abortion just needed to be legal, because it needed to be between a woman and a woman or girl and her doctor.
Right.
And you can't involve
Anyone else?
Yes.
Now, here's the thing. In voting to uphold, in voting to overturn Roe versus Wade, Justice Kavanaugh did say that states cannot prevent one of their residents from going out of state to get an abortion. So that would mean, if we include Roberts in this, that would mean that an attempt of a state to punish someone who goes to another state for an abortion, that could fail 5-4. Because Kavanaugh kept emphasizing that it's up to the states.
He's gone back on his word before, though.
And so, Lindsey Graham, how much can you trust what a Republican says? Because the next day they say the exact opposite.
Yeah. So and also Alito's majority opinion kept saying Roe arrogated this, and now we're returning it to the people and their state representatives. So,
Which is a wonderful way to spin this.
Yeah.
You used to have a guaranteed right, and we've taken it away. That's what they're really
Right,
saying.
exactly. So, also there is a right of interstate travel.
Mm-hmm.
I would, on this, curiously, I would take Kavanaugh at his word that while he will allow each state to ban abortion, he will not allow any state to criminalize the constitutionally protected right of interstate travel, even if it's for abortion.
Yeah, I wouldn't give him that. If Lindsey Graham had ever stood by his word and not contradicted himself
thank you,
5
Kavanaugh.
times, I know.
Yeah.
If Lindsey Graham had not contradicted himself 5 times in the last year or two, and Mitch McConnell had not also contradicted everything that he said in the last decade or so, then maybe I would think that maybe Republicans could stand by their word. But I've yet to
But
see that happen.
even-
When Trump and all of the supporters of Trump say that Trump is not going to do anything against trans people or the gay community, and then he does.
Yeah.
When they say it's not a Muslim ban, and then Trump says, "Oh yes, it is a Muslim ban." Yeah, I'm not.
Even with Kavanaugh himself, he
Yeah,
said
well-
that Roe versus Wade was established precedent and that he wouldn't overturn
Right.
it, and he did.
So that's true. So the thing is, but on this, he said this as a sitting justice, as if he's warning the states. He's saying, okay, ban it if you want, but don't try to stop your residents from going to where it's legal. This, he put that in the opinion.
And I think it has no weight.
Then okay,
It's the
we
word of a
will find out.
Republican.
I'm just saying, I don't want to get to that point.
Yeah.
I don't want to
hear
get
you.
to that
Yeah.
point, but I'm afraid we'll get to that point. But I mean, so those of us who write amicus briefs for the court, we would play to him on that one.
Gotcha.
Just like it was a more sure thing to play to his predecessor, Justice Kennedy, because we got him on a wide variety of cases, though we lost him on others. And so that's what we would have to do. But I think that the criminalizing, or the effort to criminalize leaving your home state to go to another state, if that doesn't cause a public upheaval, then we just can't galvanize.
Not enough people sometimes even have the means to take off work and leave the state to get, and we're not even talking just about life-saving abortions, because I was talking to someone who's giving me a pelvic exam, an ultrasound technique, and she did not believe that people in life-threatening conditions couldn't get an abortion. But the rules now in some states are you have to prove that you're in life-threatened condition. Well, let's just say that you're not, your vital signs are not there, but you had an accident and you're paralyzed and you need an abortion to work on your spine. This happened in Texas. Somebody had to leave the state or they would be paralyzed to wait on that operation to not be quadriplegic the rest of their life.
Well,
They don't see the consequences. Like the people that support these draconian abortion restrictions, they don't see the consequences until it happens to them, their children, and then it's too late.
So let's say that a woman here in Arizona with its new restrictive law says, I'm going to California just to visit friends, and then she has an abortion there and comes back. The question is, even if her doctor is pro-choice and the doctor first documents the pregnancy, can she say to the doctor, just don't say any more about it? And then her medical records would read, she was pregnant on February 5th. On April 6th, she came back for an exam, and I found this, and not even mention the pregnancy. See, what would happen, we're not there yet, but we could be, is will a state try to monitor? Or will a woman say to the doctor, we're going to have women do home pregnancy tests, and then ask the doctor not to report it, because if it's in a lab, it'll be of record.
I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Texas, there was one legislator who wanted a list of all people who changed gender on their driver's licenses. He wanted their names. He wanted the number of them and their names.
He wasn't a legislator. Our Attorney General, Ken Paxton.
That's not a legislator?
No,
Is he?
the
No,
Attorney
it's not,
General.
no, none of their business. And what will happen probably is that women need to be informed that if you're in an abortion banning state, you take the pregnancy test on your own. If it's positive, you tell no one, or you just travel.
Yeah, the workarounds. We should not have to work around our own government.
Right.
Like
But
this.
this is how it may.
How dire it is.
Yeah, it may have to be, and the outcry, even when Roe was overturned, the outrage did not meet the moment. It was not powerful enough.
Until other people start experiencing it.
Yeah. So, okay, it's now 10 months since Roe was overturned. In the last 10 months, on that issue alone, we're a different country.
Yes.
Think about April of 22 and April of 23. Look at the enormous change in the landscape of access to abortion services.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was proud to be an American where at least I was free.
And how do you argue with Christians when they say, oh, well, she can push this ectopic pregnancy, God will take care of it, there'll be a miracle. Maybe they believe this. And medically, that's not sound. The studies do not support that God's intervening to save ectopic pregnancies. But people with their religious beliefs, they're not going to, they're so unreachable to understand that this is not science. This is not what science tells us.
Yeah, there's nothing we can, you're right. I mean, what has to happen is we have to go back to the days when the government could not enact religious-based restrictions into law. We have to go back to those precedents that are now being eroded, and that's not happening.
How would you even do that when the Supreme Court has made so many bad rulings? Not just the Kavanaugh Supreme Court. Prior
Amy
to-
Coney Barrett.
Yeah. What you have to do is at some point we have to have a new justices in place and start reversing these bad decisions, just like they're reversing our good decisions.
Yeah.
And it may be sort of like the birth and death of stars and galaxies. It may go on indefinitely.
Yeah.
We lose the freedom, we get it back. We lose it, we get it back. I don't know how long it could go on.
Suffering, though,
Yeah,
the suffering at when people lose these things, it's enormous. What you were saying about how we've had presidents in the past where we can't rely on religious beliefs to determine law, like the Salem witch trials. They decided that spectral evidence, well, the devil can do that too. Well, we know that as atheists, there's no devil, but how do you admit that into court? It's so subjective, and why does it weigh more than medical and scientific studies that this abortion needs to be performed, that you think God's going to do a miracle here for this woman? It's not going to happen.
So this is, the concept is believe what you want, but you can't impose it on others through force of law. That's self-evident, or at least it used to be. So the question is, next year, obviously part of a 501c3 can't specifically endorse or oppose candidates, but to say, all elections for president and U.S. Senate should be deemed uppermost as a referendum on the court. Yeah.